Thanks, Alan, and welcome to my talk on closing the gap on Twilio. And the title I've previously chosen is Challenges Consuming Programmable Telecoms from developers' perspective. And I put here three statements. I want to share a bit of our learnings we had at EMEA. But I think given that I'm with DT, I wanted to focus a bit on what's in it for telcos and CPass Programmable Telecoms, and actually closing the gap on Twilio and elaborating whether there is one and what it's actually like. Shortly about me, my CV is essentially the same as last year. I added 1 year in DT now, so I've been with DT for a year and a bit, attending TADSummit, TADHack since 2014, and want to share a bit my view and things I learned over the years, and now especially with being in DT. So when we talk about closing the gap on Twilio, what I found interesting, and I'm not a numbers guy, so I don't know if there is really like financial relevance in the figures, but I found it very interesting to compare it a bit. So looking at the Twilio revenue, Twilio is considered the market leader in CPass by many analysts. They have a large revenue growth year by year. Last year it was $650 million US dollars. They have a very high rate of revenue per employee. A lot of customers, and growth year per year is pretty much increasing. So the 2019 number is probably going to be close to 1 billion in revenue, which is very interesting. However, comparing that to DT, and again, I don't know like the relevance of it, but I found it very interesting. If we look at DT revenue as one carrier only, and not even the market leader, so and not even in the biggest market. So of one group, which is 75.7 billion euro, and net profit, I added that here, a positive net profit of a bit more than 2 billion, while Nexmo is still at loss last year. It's pretty interesting, and you might wonder, looking at that, I added a bit like to make it really to show the orders of magnitude that just one carrier is kind of earning over Twilio. What's really the relevance? Why should we even bother looking at Twilio if we make actually so much money and compare it to a rather small market, just looking at the figures? And again, maybe it's not really comparable, but I just found it very interesting talking about it. And even if we compare apples and oranges, I try to put it a bit in perspective in looking at the unit I'm working in now, and I try to find figures actually breaking down that huge revenue that we make. It's access, of course, it's fixed, it's mobile, it's various markets all over Europe and the US. I tried to break this down a bit to get a grasp on what is actually attributable to voice and messaging and communications in general. And the only figure I found that is somehow I can relate to is in our annual report. There is one column marked revenue from fixed network. It's attributed to the headquarters, and the wholesale unit of DT is part of the headquarters. There's actually written that it's like this is an amount that's mainly generated through wholesale services for international carriers, including voice as well as data. So essentially, looking at that figure, that's somewhat the same revenue as Twilio. We are in the business of selling voice, SMS, and many other things, of course. And I think that's something I want to focus in. If you're looking at that very small part of one carrier out there that makes money with connectivity, what's in it for CPass, and why is it a relevant discussion actually for carriers? It has been touched in the morning, by the way, very nicely, and I think coming from a carrier, my view is that it's very relevant. There's a lot of potential, and we're going to see a lot of transitionings that has been touched on as well in the morning. So from a telco perspective, we are mostly, or in the past, carriers compare themselves very often with alternative communication service providers. They would call them OTT. We call them alternative communication service providers, not to be shamed on Twitter and elsewhere. So, but it's really what it is. It's a modern carrier, very, very different to legacy telcos. What legacy telcos, how they produce communication is been seen as an NT business, network technology business, that has here and there some IT systems and IT stack that's just supporting it, but it's really an NT business, and NT is driving the evolution. It's NT people trying to reinvent how they do stuff that's been done in the other world or in the other side for a long time. It's usually a local business that's supported, of course, by inter-carrier production, so to connect all the local business to a global kind of ecosystem. while the alternative communication service providers, they're in another kind of industry. They're in the economy play. It's global. You have a handful of relevant market players that you would usually compare it with. And it's both rather closed, but very differently closed. The one is closed as a community, but open within. So if you're a telco, you can very easily peer with other telcos. It's this kind of open ecosystem with interconnect agreements and all these things you needed to do in the past. While down here, you could interconnect it, but it's not done. It's walled gardens. The question is also whether it makes sense, considering it's not just connectivity, but it's usually connectivity embedded in certain contexts. And interconnecting them from an experience perspective doesn't really make sense. And then you have the view of the ecosystem. You have a very, very dependent one for carriers. You have OEMs that give out phones. You have network providers. You have access providers, core network providers, and many other players that somehow follow standards to make sure that on the interfaces you can interoperate. While down here, it's really not a big question. You're providing the app, you're providing the backend, and whatever you do in between is essentially your thing. So it's an end-to-end service that sometimes uses carrier technology when you want to make a classic phone call, but more often than not, that's not really the case. And the biggest difference is the one is still very physical. Of course, you do still get into virtualization in operators, but it's still physical. Your phone number is still very often or more often than not tied to your physical SIM. You have physical sockets at home that you can touch where the connectivity comes out. And down here, it's more or less all virtual. So it's enabled by, you could say it's all digital, but we don't do that either. So we say it's enabled by software, connectivity, and the cloud. So you have basically a global infrastructure for producing services. It's all connected, devices are connected. And with IT paradigms, following software and building these platforms, let's say, not by putting boxes into racks, but by doing something on top of them, you have essentially enabled these communication service provider to provide communication service platforms. So where does CPass fit into all of that? Looking at it, I look at it, and there are, I guess, different views. I guess if you have a bit of a view from a carrier, for me, CPass is an API enabler on top of telco assets. So that's mostly, let's say, if you have an SMS or a voice platform and you add a CPass on top, instead of coming from the south and connecting via SIP or SMPP or legacy protocols, you would use modern APIs, come from the top and access these assets, augmented with various features to enable programmable telecoms. So of course, there's more than just, let's say, one-on-one mappings. What these providers do, so if you're a CPass provider, if you're not a CPass on top of an operator, but if you're a CPass provider, you're very often also an aggregator and would aggregate assets from various telcos. So if some telcos have direct connection in some markets, others have in other markets, what you would do is you would also aggregate that on top and also integrate alternative communications providers' assets. So essentially, it's both an API enabler that augments assets from telcos, but also from other communication service providers, not CPass providers, but communication service providers. So a messaging on Twilio or on other platforms has also integration with Facebook Messengers, there's integration with WhatsApp, and now even integration with RCS as well, right? One thing CPass technology overall has in common, and that's again important for the discussion, is it follows paradigms driven by software companies. So the differentiation is not really on the underlying infrastructure, but the abstraction allows to differentiate based on, or to produce services actually enabled by, again, most features that are common in the IT world. So we have the cloud-based production, you can go global, you can focus on local markets, and the competitors, again, Twilio does this more and more, looks at local enterprise markets and goes a bit away from attracting just long-tail developers, but really look at enterprises. You have a very fast automated provisioning and billing. That's, again, a very big differentiator to carriers. Usually, if you want to interconnect, and at least with the more conservative carriers, let's say, you have a very long time and very complex processes that you somehow need to map. These CPass providers usually, and if you introduce CPass technology, one of the essential things is to abstract that and to not, you cannot, if you go to a CPass provider and it takes 5 days to provision your SIP account, it's I think not really anything people would be interested in. So it's not just making assets available, but it's also having the underlying technology and processes follow up with the paradigms that is expected behind this technology. And what we see as well is a very little relevance on standards to get started. So CPass providers did not sit in a room organized by CPass Provider Association and discuss standards, how to get started, and wait 10 years and then eventually get started. But what they do is they just go out there. They go out there, they provide easy-to-use APIs, they provide easy-to-use SDKs. You start with best practices. Developers can easily, move between these APIs if you use SDKs or if it's even plain REST APIs. And eventually, some of them turn into somewhat standards, if you wish. So what Twilio offers now is used by other CPass providers. It's been used by RESTCom for a long time. So you see some kind of, not really standards, but at least you see some ways certain providers do it become essentially the relevant or one of the relevant ways to do it. It's a bit like what we saw with AWS. AWS for a long time, they never standardized really anything, but for a long time, they've become the de facto way of doing cloud. And that's, I guess, the same thing we see here. You can't really get around local regulation. That's also an interesting point. So if you're a relevant CPass player and not just enabling, let's say, non-carrier asset communication, if you wish, but as soon as you tap into the carrier assets, the CPass players realize they need to play by the same rules, at least in most markets, and at least once they're big enough. So if you're with Voxbone or with Twilio, you can get numbers in regulated markets, but you need to provide as well, and they need to have processes to map the way of checking documents, of uploading and proving your residency and other things. So it's easy to get a number on Twilio, for example, from Germany, but you need to upload all your details and they need to check it. It's very fast, so it's still faster than signing a contract with a carrier, which is pretty interesting, but still there is some kind of manual process as well involved. And the last part is that and this is, I find quite interesting, again, in the fit of comparing here, if we see here, carrier who produces still a lot of minutes in SMS, it's a purely volume-driven business. Down here, it's very much an experience-driven business. Volume is not really a relevant metric, I would say here. It's relevant, it's eyeballs, it's access to users, and what you do on top of it. And for CPass, it's somewhat in the middle. It's a lot of value creation here is, of course, volume, because that's how they make money, but it's adding on top of the plain assets from carriers. And to showcase that, I did a small comparison here as well, Nexmo. So I would say that the market leaders, looking at what they do, if we take a reference price for SMS and voice, how you could get it from a carrier, not even with special contracts, just you go there, you say you want to do it, you wait a bit, and then you get access to it. What they do is they add a lot of margin on top for themselves. So Twilio adds for an SMS 55% compared to the reference price I took. For Nexmo, it's a bit less. For calling, it's close to 300% uplift. So it's really, really interesting that just exposing it by an API, put a bit of lines of code in between, allows you that much margin, actually shows the potential also for carriers, let's say, to just get such a platform and get started. And for other things, it's even more when you look at not just the bare access to the asset as such, but when you go into use cases, when you say when you verify an SMS, once you verify a phone number, you add even more. So for Nexmo, the price would again be uplifted by 33% compared to that number. Twilio adds 5 cents. And back at EMEA, we used all of that, all of these things, and we know kind of how convenient it is, for example, to just use a verification function and not implement it yourself. We implement it ourselves, but then you have problems. You need to verify the phone number. You need to make sure it's a valid phone number. You need to write all the logic, deal with the exceptions. So it's very convenient to use that, and it's in the beginning at least very much worth paying the extra money, I would say. So I think that's kind of an interesting comparison. And when I go around DT and show this slide, people are like don't even know what to say. One interesting figure is also this year. So we always say like OTT traffic is for free, let's say, in quotation marks here. But what actually Twilio manages, they even manage to monetize this. So even if you do a pure voice call, VoIP call, using their stack, pure WebRTC to WebRTC, they even price this per minute and tell this to a carrier. So it's really an interesting metric. They really, just because it's convenient and just because it moves the way dealing with communications, you essentially consume it really as a service. They're even able to price this. I don't know what's the attribution of that for the overall figure, but it's interesting that they have a price tag behind that. So looking at that and going back of what I explained, is CPass a threat? Is it a curse, or rather a blessing for us telcos? And I think overall, I don't want to go through these market numbers. You can look them up. I put them in here. So the market is forecasted to be growing from to 11 billion from 2 billion 2 years ago. We have many digital transformation projects in the company. What that means is essentially process optimization and less, let's say, manual processes and more integrated processes. And communications has become a big part of that. So that's kind of where the demand from enterprise, I think, comes from, building communications into your processes and optimizing them. And there is a big potential that I think also carriers can grasp and should grasp. On the other hand, what they need to be aware of is that Twilio and other CPass providers are some kind of new kind of competition that essentially bring you traffic, and many carriers, especially wholesale units, are selling to them, and they're happy that they bring traffic. But what they do is they abstract, of course, from the complexity of the network. So the complexity that was kind of a protective login in the past is no longer there. You can move maybe even easier between carriers. And on the other hand, they capture a lot of value we've seen before, and also the customer relationship. And that's maybe not necessarily what you want. And what this all leads to, and this was a thought that just occurred to me recently, I hope we can discuss this a bit, is that, so if you look at it from a carrier perspective, I think CPass as such is evolving to something I call it here telecommunications support system, in a bit of an analogy from OSS BSS. So we have now TSS, kind of communication support system of many applications and services, which leads to actually making the role of telcos themselves, at least for communications. I'm not saying overall, you always have connectivity, but at least for communication, less relevant. And I try to depict this here a bit. Talking about this telecommunication support system, I don't know if that's a good term or not, but what it essentially shows is that we are seeing the move from a previously IT-centric service that has been produced by carriers, supported by OSS BSS, to a very IT-centric service. So it's all the paradigms telcos now try to employ, cloudification and whatever, and exposure. They tried to do this for many years. They're still trying it. I think it's very IT-centric. It has become very IT-centric, and the actual telecommunication assets are now are becoming to be more and more the supporting functions of it. Summarize this a bit in a kind of one sentence that I'm not going to read now, but essentially should show that it was a very end-to-end focused stack. OSS BSS was only the supporting part, and essentially it won't go away. You still need to connect people, and you will need to optimize that lowest common denominator, and it's being optimized. It has been optimized from 2G to 3G to 4G, and it's going to be even more optimized in 5G. And it's still relevant also because you still have kind of, you connect the eyeballs and everyone, and you can reach everyone. It's universal, and that's what makes CPass also relevant in a way to have access to this. But I think the real value will shift a bit from here, because this is very connectivity driven from a carrier view, to the gateway function, where it's all about improved service experiences and also about exposing your assets in a way. And what it leads to is what it should lead to is IT-centric. What do I mean by that? A very business process supporting communications enabler that we should become, and we should really employ modern IT paradigms as carriers, because only then we're able to compete and to catch up, and we can leverage also again, don't want to do buzzword bingo, but we can leverage also new enablers that are used only by classic internet communication service providers if we produce them and provide them as consumable assets and as infrastructure in a way. I guess we also have an interesting role to play. And to shortly, and it's going to be a bit similar graphic than that the Basel guys presented this morning. I found it very interesting. I don't have this nice picture, but it's essentially leading down to the same. So if we look at this customer experience technology, and I took a quote from the website as well, where we have C for connectivity and communications, which is essentially what carriers provide, and we add experience to it, and we add the enabler part to it. We essentially have this kind of evolution that we see. So this is the universe you saw this morning in a way, right? So we had NT focus with a little bit of IT. Now we are at a really converged view where it really has to go to, I believe, is that as a carrier, we need to focus on enabling experience creation, exposing our NT assets with an IT way, but it's not really that the NT part as such is it's still the core essentially because it's the asset it's part of the asset we have. But I think making it available has to be done in a way differently. So to come slowly to the conclusion, I think there's a lot of potential in programmable telecoms also for carrier, looking at that kind of scenario of being customer experience tech enabler. There's a lot of relative margin, as we've seen before. I think the paradigm and to overthink the NT-IT split, let's say, in the past, that IT is only an enabling and a supporting organization. This will massively change in the future, and carriers who realize this sooner or later will have a huge, improved possibility in the market. That's the word now for that. And overall, there are many questions to be answered. Should you buy it? Should you build it yourself? Should you partner? Some carriers acquired. Some people here in the room are working for acquired CPass and so on. So I think there's a lot of issues to tackle, but overall the relevance of it, even though the relative figure is rather small, the relevance I think is there, and carriers should look into that. And to kind of conclude a bit, I haven't really touched these points, but I think, and I will kind of show it on the next slide, I think these points, what makes it special, and you need to know what you have to do still consuming APIs, and there's a difference between telecoms development, app development. It's only there because carriers believe still about this special role, and looking at NT, that you need a special expertise for the NT stack, and you need to have specialized engineers, and maybe some VNFs are more special than a classic Apache web server. But overall, this specialty, I think, will disappear. And if we start treating telecoms like yet another IT application, I think once we get this into our mind, we have a very big potential of disrupting even this more or less not settled market, but market that has already evolved quite a bit of CPass players. And we will basically see what we saw in the past for fixed mobile. So it was two separate worlds in the past, and one did something different than the others. One, was still growing while the other already downscaled a bit. I think if we see what happened here, and that it really converged, that it really went together, and it's not yet there. If you talk about fully converged, that you can take a fixed number on a mobile and vice versa, we are not there yet. For some carriers, some are there, but I think we'll really see this happening also in the NT and IT world. So IT organizations, if they just take an API server, put it in front of the NT asset, they can go out and make telco assets available and transform themselves actually to an enabling organization rather than a supporting one. And I think that's then also allowing modern IT-supported telcos with the IT mindset, if I may call it like this, to compete and find their place in the market. And then one day, the app developer, to come back at the topic here, the call will really be just another API call. You will not need to understand complexities of call states and of traversions and so on. You can just use a library and SDK. You don't need to consume complex API where I need to differentiate between services. This will all be abstracted. You don't need to have various endpoints for provisioning a number and then for making a call and all these complexities that the non-leading CPass players face. You will all have this. You have this all abstracted, and essentially telecoms will just be one API and a huge ecosystem that you can hopefully integrate to build better services. Thanks. So we have a panel later on where we can discuss some of the things as well.